So don't judge me, but I was watching an Instagram reel, which, as you probably know, is basically just TikTok, but on Instagram for geriatric millennials like me who can't figure out how to work a new platform. And so it just feeds you vertical videos for days. Cute, funny, amusing things that just show up on your screen. And the algorithm, which naturally knows every particle of my being, knows my going in and my coming out, my standing up and my sitting down, figured out that it should serve me this video of a girl talking about the titles of fantasy novels. And she pointed out that like every fantasy series has a title that goes like the something of something and something. They all sound like this. The Song of Ice and Fire, A Court of Thorns and Roses, A Crown of Cheese and Bananas, or whatever. And so today I'm going to be bringing you Aeneas and Dido, A Tale of Love and War. Now, they say that all is fair in love and war. That's certainly going to be the case here. We're going to have twists and turns, ups and downs, brutal betrayals, heartbreaking disasters, tragedies, thrills, chills, excitement, romance. It's all here in the tale of love and war. And I wanted to frame it that way, as this tale of two distinct things, these kind of opposing, opposite themes, love and war, because I want to talk to you today about ring composition. This is a major literary technique that I think Virgil is using here. It's one of the most ancient impulses in storytelling to tell a ring story. That is a story that proceeds in a kind of loop. And by the end of it, there are themes that were there at the beginning that you've kind of forgotten that then come back up at the end. And then within that big giant ring, you might have other nested rings like concentric circles. So the first scene is kind of mirrored by the last scene, but then the second scene will be mirrored by the second to last scene. And this can get incredibly complicated, incredibly quickly. And like I say, it's one of the most satisfying storytelling techniques. So people have been using it forever. For as long as people have been telling stories, they've been using ring composition, and they're still doing it. Harry Potter, by the way, the Harry Potter series is full of ring composition. So we're going to get into that, talk about how this stuff works and how Virgil uses it to build suspense throughout the story of Aeneas and Dido. But first, it's an exciting time because there is finally a new term open at the Ancient Language Institute. New year, new term. ALI is one of my longest standing sponsors. I have the highest possible respect for the work they do. This is language instruction done right, and it's ancient languages, so the kinds of languages that we talk about on this show. It's catnip for young Heretics listeners. If you're enjoying listening to me talking about the Aeneid, and you're enjoying my translations, and you're enjoying me talking about the artistry of Virgil, what better way could there be to go deeper into this great poem than to actually learn Latin and be able to read it in the original? It's one of the chief joys of scholarly life when you start to be able to do that. And what's really cool about the Ancient Language Institute is that they make you start reading original stuff really soon. You're able to dig into these original texts like the Aeneid very early on, no matter where you are in your learning process right now. If you've already done some Latin or some Greek, or if you've never even touched anything in any language other than English, they can help you. They can meet you at your level. And their summer term is now filling up. Registration closes on April 19th. So what you're going to want to do is go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics. This is the best kept secret on the internet because I don't print this anywhere. I don't tweet about it. I don't talk about it on my Substack. I just do it here for listeners to the podcast. If you go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics, you can enter the offer code Spencer, that's just my name, SPENCER, and get a discount on your registration fee. They've got tons of great course offerings: Latin, Greek, Biblical Hebrew. They've just started Old English, Anglo-Saxon. I'm actually working through their Old English book right now, Oswald Bera. I had a friend on who wrote the book, Colin Gorey, to talk to me about it. We did a cool interview episode together. So you can sign up for any one of those, whichever interests you most. And for my teachers out there, I know I got some language teachers and history teachers that listen to this podcast. They're also running a course for teachers. It's called the Latin Teacher Boot Camp. This is a 5-week online summer intensive. If you're looking for something to do to sharpen your skills, maybe get back to basics, rekindle your love of the subject over the summer, this would be a great option for you. And it's also a prerequisite for joining their mentorship year. They have a mentorship year for teachers where they'll give you weekly online meetings to just help you keep your love of the subject alive, maybe give you some new ideas for classes you've been teaching for a while. Really great stuff for anyone at any level. One more time, it's ancientlanguage.com/heretics. And the discount code is just my name, Spencer, SPENCER, to go deeper into the good stuff, which is what we like talking about here. So without further ado, let's talk about ring composition. Let's talk about this ancient storytelling technique that just sends a little thrill up your spine every time it happens. It's one of those ones, tried and true, never fails to satisfy. When it's done right, ring composition can be awesome because it gives you that feeling that, oh, there was a plan here all along, and I didn't see it. Maybe the seeds were planted early on in the first scene, and then suddenly it comes back up in the last scene, and you see the whole thing all at once. And that's a key to good storytelling. One of the things that Aristotle teaches us about stories is that they need to have a coherent structure, beginning, middle, and end. They don't just dip into events anywhere randomly. The author actually carefully has to pick the plot and the outline of the narrative so that it gives this feeling of order and gives a feeling of causation, that this thing leads to that, leads to that, leads to that, because that's the job of the artist, is to take the jumble of events in real life and discern a pattern or an order that brings together one sequence of things and makes it something complete. So I mentioned that this idea of ring composition is everywhere in Harry Potter, and that's probably the easiest way to get a handle on what it is, because most people out there, I think, have read or encountered the Harry Potter series in some way or another. If you're like me, you read them as they were coming out. I was a kid actually in England when Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone first showed up, and then as they were coming out, I actually didn't like them at first and then kind of gradually got sucked into them until finally I was waiting at the bookstore at midnight for Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the last one. So I'm an OG Harry Potter fan, and I love J.K. Rowling. I love her public presence as well. But I know a lot of people have gotten to know these stories through the movies too. Maybe you weren't around when the books were coming out, or you just didn't really catch that craze when it was out, but then they made these movies, which I think are, pretty good. They're not Lord of the Rings level adaptations, but I like the Harry Potter movies too. And the books and the movies both use this device where things that we know and love from the beginning, that we have a certain attachment to, kind of come up at the end. And there's a million of these sort of scattered throughout. I would be very surprised if J.K. Rowling didn't do some of this intentionally. For example, the dragons. So dragons show up in only 3 books of the Harry Potter series. There's one in the first book, there's one in the last book, and there's also one in the middle, which is a classic ring composition device to kind of have like a donut. If you've got the big ring that encompasses the whole story, then there's a little filling, a little jelly filling in the middle. So there's a dragon donut in Harry Potter, because we start in the first book, in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. If you remember Hagrid's baby dragon, baby Norbert, who turns out to be Norberta, because it's a girl. And then at the very end, there's a big full-grown ancient dragon in Gringotts that the team used to escape. It's on the cover of some of the editions that they fly out. So from this little teeny tiny dragon up to the big ultimate finale conclusion. And then in the middle, you have book 4, The Goblet of Fire, which one of its climaxes is a fight with Harry and a dragon. One of the challenges in the Triwizard Tournament is that he has to get something from a dragon. So very carefully, and I'm sure intentionally, J.K. Rowling has created this kind of ring structure that begins with these small origin seeds, kind of gives us an image of the dragon at the beginning, and then makes one of the major plot points at the very end hinge upon a full giant grown dragon. In the middle, you have a dragon in its full flush of youth, essentially. So it's very artfully done. That's a basic example of ring composition. Something begins at the beginning, ends at the end, and then is also dropped there in the middle. There's a bunch of these in the last one, kind of callbacks or throwbacks to the first book that are in the last book. Like the last book, Deathly Hallows, begins at Privet Drive. Harry has to escape from the house at Privet Drive, which is, of course, where his story begins. And in the middle, he ends up in all these different places, but the story sort of begins and ends with an opening scene at Privet Drive. There's a device called the Deluminator that Dumbledore uses to take the lights out of the street lamps at the very beginning of the first book, and then that device also plays a key role in the last book, with Ron trying to use it to find Harry and Hermione after he's left them in a huff. In the middle, the Deluminator also shows up. Book 5, Mad-Eye Moody uses it. So there's a ton of these, and there's even, to really clue you in case you hadn't picked up on it yet, there's that line which is on the snitch at the very end of Harry Potter, "I open at the close." If you remember, he gets the snitch that he had found as part of his search for the Deathly Hallows. He has the snitch which contains the Philosopher's Stone, and he needs it in order to beat Voldemort. And it says, "I open at the close," which turns out to mean that I open up at the very end of your life, because he's about to go and sacrifice himself and die. And so it's that double meaning that my beginning is in my ending, in my end is my beginning. All of that T.S. Eliot stuff kind of comes up in Harry Potter. There's a lot more to those books if you look through them closely. There's a lot more than you may have noticed the first time, and ring composition is everywhere throughout it. So that kind of gives you an idea. I mean, the classic modern way of describing a ring composition is it's a throwback or a callback. And actually there's a website called I Open at the Close, which has a bunch of different Harry Potter callbacks. There's also a great article by a woman named Beatrice Groves, whom I actually know, and who is a literary scholar of Harry Potter. She analyzes J.K. Rowling's work. She is married to the pastor at a church that I used to go to a lot in Oxford, so I have some friendship with her, and she does awesome work on Harry Potter. I'm going to link to one of her articles about this whole link and riddle pattern in Harry Potter and this idea of ring composition that comes back up. So that's just kind of to get us into this idea of the ring composition and how that works. It's a classic literary technique. It's still everywhere. J.K. Rowling uses it well. Now that you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. It basically shows up throughout all of human history. The Bible is full of it. If you're a regular Bible reader, or even if you're coming to the Bible for the first time, you will start to notice, especially throughout the book of Genesis, a lot of very careful ring compositions. And of course, there's huge theological significance to the idea of the ring composition, because it suggests that God had a plan all along. The stuff that is there, foreshadowed, prefigured in the beginning, shows up again at the end in this new transmuted form. The baby dragon grows up to the giant Gringotts dragon. A classic example of this would be the story of Noah. If you trace the story of Noah and the flood in Genesis book 6, you will see that it begins with all this stuff that then comes back again in reverse order at the end. So we start out hearing about Noah and his sons. At the very end, of course, we hear about Noah and his sons and what they do to populate the world. The next thing that comes up is this description of all the different life on the earth. Then, of course, at the end, the life on earth is repopulated, goes out and fills the world again. Earth is cursed in the story at the beginning and then blessed at the end. Then there's a flood, but then shortly before the final blessing, there's a promise that there will be no more flood. So all of these different echoes and callbacks happen in the story, and at the core of it, of course, is the flood itself and the connection between God and Noah. So it's obviously presented in this very intentional way. And by the way, that doesn't mean that it's not based on some reality. There's been archaeological evidence to suggest that, in fact, there was a giant flood, even if you aren't committed to believing in the truth of the story in advance. There's plenty of evidence to support that this is a real story. Doesn't mean that it can't also be presented with ring composition. So there's at least 3 different ways you can do this. One is to make up a story and tell it in this carefully crafted way. The other would be to take a true story and present it in a ring composition form. And then the third kind of galaxy brain take would be that ring composition, like all satisfying narrative forms, are satisfying because they reflect structures that we find embedded in the world. So if you're kind of a nihilist or an atheist, or you don't really believe there's any inherent order to the universe, then you just think, well, we like these kinds of stories. Maybe it satisfies some mammalian, ancestral, evolutionary desire, and therefore we tell them, and we even shape our experiences that we've actually had. We retell them and reshape them into this ring composition format. That would be the materialist, atheist way of describing it. Obviously, my way is different. I think that we don't just have these connections, these responses to certain types of story because, I don't know, they satisfy our hindbrain or something. I've never found those explanations to make any sense at all, especially since many of the things that we do in art don't have an obvious purpose. But instead, I think that the world is a kind of story, and there is a narrative and a form of communication embedded into the world. God spoke and created the world, and the world has a narrative structure. And so when we tell stories that have this artful form to them, we're just doing the same thing as a painter does when he looks out at a landscape and he chooses the frame that looks most beautiful, the vista that looks most beautiful. We are adding our creative perspective, but we're not inventing stuff out of thin air. We're looking at a world that is already full of beauty and meaning. Similarly, we're living lives that have beginnings, middles, and ends. We're living lives that might be chained and looped into these kind of ring composition formats. And everything that we do, every moment of our experience, tells us a story. And the ring composition format, the idea that what happens at the end was prefigured at the beginning, is very deeply baked into us. And I would suggest that's because, in fact, we are ultimately on a grand trajectory that will restore us back to our original condition at paradise. That's what I think all of this is ultimately about. If you ask me for my big brain kind of tinfoil hat take, it's that we fell at Eden, we have an ancestral memory of a lost paradise, and now we are being redeemed. We are on our way to an end of the story that brings back and consummates what there was in the beginning of the story. That's why we love ring composition. That's why it's all over the Bible. And that's why people keep having this kind of impulse, even without realizing, keep having this impulse to do it. So that's just my take on what ring composition is. Whether you agree with me about that or not, undeniably, ring composition is a powerful form of storytelling that people have used throughout all of storytelling history, and the Aeneid is no exception. There are plenty of examples of ring structures within the Aeneid, and I'm going to suggest to you that actually there's a giant ring composition stretching throughout the entire Aeneid that can help us to keep track of the structure of the thing as we follow and we go through it. Basically, the whole thing is a giant ring of love and war. And it's really, really complicated, and there are interlocking rings within rings. And of course, once the ring composition gets going, there's no end to the number of little rings that you can loop inside of the big rings and all of that stuff. But I think this is a story of love and war that begins and ends with war. One of the most famous things about the Aeneid, just spoiler alert to preview what we're going to get to at the end, is that it stops in basically the middle of a battle. There is an act of violence at the very end. And people have debated for a long time. Virgil died with the poem unfinished, and it's not clear whether he meant for the poem to end that way. But one reason why I suspect he actually kind of did is because that creates a war ring that encircles the poem. The poem, remember, begins with the end of the Trojan War. So there's an act of violence, the destruction of a city, and the end of Troy is the beginning of the poem, kicks off the events. And at the very, very end, we're also going to get an act of violence that creates a new city, that is, founds Lavinium, which will ultimately give rise to the line of kings that will produce Rome. And so we're looking here in the big, big picture, we're looking at a poem that begins with violence and war and ends with violence and war. And then in between, within, you have stories of love, like the one between Aeneas and Dido. And then within those stories, there are other rings of violence and war looped and interlocked with stories of love and passion. And one of the things that Virgil does to build suspense is he's always inviting us to ask whether any given ring is going to ultimately end with love, end with a happy ending, or end with war, end with violence and death and having to struggle on and toil and labor. So we're kind of always asking, as we read these first few books of the Aeneid, we're always asking, is this a war donut filled with love jelly, or is this a love donut filled with war jelly? And it's not that war is necessarily always bad. Sometimes war is necessary, but obviously there's a big question in front of Aeneas about what his duty is and how it relates to his life and his desires and his own personal aspirations and ambitions. And that is the major conflict that he's going to first and foremost be presented with in this story of Dido. So within the giant war ring that begins with his exile from Troy and ends with the war he fights to found Lavinium, there are several love rings, and this is one of them. The Dido story is one of the love stories, and then later on he will have a new love interest. Again, spoiler alert, I've already told you that Dido is not going to end up with him, and that's important for the story because she's Carthage, and so she has to fall down. But they have a little love ring in the first half of the poem, the Odyssey half, and then there's another love ring within the second half of the poem, which is the Iliad half, and that's Lavinia, the woman that he marries in order to found Rome. And there's, in some sense, there's a contrast between these two unions. Like, Dido is the alluring, enticing, wonderful queen. She's already been compared to a variety of goddesses. Now I think she's going to look to us a lot like perhaps Nausicaa from the Phaeacians, or maybe Circe or Calypso, a lot of these inviting women that allured Odysseus on his way. So now Dido is going to fill that role for Aeneas. She's going to be Aeneas' version of all those temptresses that Odysseus had to face. And just like Odysseus, Aeneas is going to have to leave Dido behind and head on to his homestead in his heart. Now, for Odysseus, there was a faithful wife waiting for him at home. For Aeneas, he's going to have to move forward and create a new home and find his new wife there, Lavinia, who is sort of his Penelope, except that there's not quite the same degree of love there, obviously, because they haven't previously fallen in love. But that's all for down the road. This ring composition gets so complicated because within this little mini first love ring that is already within a war ring, we are also going to have another war story, because the first thing that happens when Aeneas meets Dido is she asks him to tell her the story of the fall of Troy. So we have Fall of Troy as the opening of a giant war ring. Then we have meeting of Aeneas and Dido as the opening of a smaller love ring. Then we have story of Troy within that smaller love ring as a little kind of war ring within the love ring. And then within that war story of Troy, we're going to have Aeneas' first wife, Creusa, in the middle of that Troy war story. So there's a love ring within a war ring, within a love ring, within a war ring. And it gets very, very Russian doll very, very quickly. But that's the structure that I wanted to call your attention to here, both because it's amazing to watch the way that Virgil works out these wheels within wheels, and because it can actually help us to get a picture of the story and see how Virgil is carefully crafting these events. Because just like Homer, he doesn't tell the story in order. He doesn't say, well, first there was the Trojan horse, and then there was the fall of Troy, and then there was Aeneas coming to Carthage, and then there was Dido, and then he does the same thing that Homer does in the Odyssey, where he kind of begins us in the middle, in medias res, as Horace would later say, and then he takes us back in time, but he does it in such a way that we're constantly being asked whether this is a war ring or a love ring, whether we are looking at the love donut with the war jelly or the war donut with the love jelly. So that's what we're doing today. We've entered into the poem as a whole, and we've embarked upon what is initially a war story of Aeneas fleeing the fall of Troy. And now we're going to enter into one of its mini sub-rings, that is the love story between Aeneas and Dido. And we are meant to be asking throughout whether this is going to end up as a love story or end up as a war story that has to continue on with more founding. And we know ultimately that Aeneas is going to found what will become Rome, so he can't actually stay in Carthage, but the suspense is building anyway because of this structure, and that's important, especially because, never forget, Dido, above all else, is a stand-in for Cleopatra. Yes, she represents Carthage. Yes, she's a way for Virgil to metaphorically tell the story of the battle between Rome and Carthage that created or helped create the empire. But also, more immediately, she is the femme fatale par excellence, the warrior princess. And that, for anybody living in the Augustan era, as Virgil was, that would have been Cleopatra. And Cleopatra also was presented, or rather she was at the core of a choice between love and war. She was the Egyptian queen that seduced two different Roman men, warriors, great men, leaders, one of whom was Julius Caesar. She slept with Julius Caesar. The other of whom was Mark Antony, the ultimate rival of Octavian, Caesar's heir. And whereas Antony went down with Cleopatra, that is, he sort of was lost to love, and love destroyed him and made him weak in war. That was part of the story of how that had happened. Octavian was able to defeat them both because he rose above the love and the seduction of Cleopatra, and he did his duty, and he defeated them at the Battle of Actium, and he created the empire. And so, in some sense, the question here is, will Aeneas be an Antony, or will he be an Octavian? Which side of this thing is he going to fall out on, and what's right to be? Because, of course, Octavian is Emperor Augustus, is the leader of the now Roman Empire, but in order to become a founder in his own right, Aeneas is going to have to give up his desire to be Antony, to just fall in love with the beautiful queen and make common cause with her and become her ally and forever stay where she lives. So that's what I'm going to propose to you today, is that Aeneas would love to be an Antony, would love to stick around like Mark Antony did with Cleopatra and fall in love with Dido and never leave. And that desire has to be real. We have to understand that desire is real in order to understand what's coming next. Because typically, or often, we get readings of the poem that say, oh, it's really all about Dido falling in love, and she's the one who's smitten, and Aeneas is just heartlessly cold and pushing forward like the evil Octavian, and therefore this is a fully anti-Augustus poem. This is a poem about how evil and heartless and cruel Octavian was for defeating Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. And there is some truth to that. We do see the coldness that it will require of Aeneas to press forward, but we also see the path not taken. We also see what it would have been like for Aeneas to stay, and it's not nothing to him. In fact, it's a huge trial for him to have to give up this desire, and that also is a theme of the poem. Everything we have to give up, lose, in order to create great things. Now, when we last left our heroes, Aeneas and his right-hand bro, Achates, remember they had washed up on shore after a shipwreck. The goddess Juno, who hates them, has tried to destroy them, but instead they've ended up in Carthage. And they go exploring, which is a classic Odyssean thing to do. They go to look and see whether they're in a civilized land or not, what sorts of people these are. And the first thing they encounter is a temple to Juno, which should scare the bejeebus out of them, because Juno is the one that just rained down all kinds of nasty on them. But they aren't scared. Instead, they're in awe. They're amazed at this work of craftsmanship and art. And I said last time that we would come back to this moment because it's an important moment that needs addressing in its own right before they go on to meet with Dido, who shows up later. And so now we're going to come back and take a look at this temple, which is another ekphrasis, another moment when Virgil stops in the poem and he describes, in this case, a work of art. Last time it was a scene, a physical location. This time it's a work of art. And so the classic kind of example here that he's drawing from is the most famous ekphrasis maybe in the world, certainly in ancient literature, and that's the shield of Achilles. In book 18 of the Iliad, Thetis, mother of Achilles, goes to Hephaestus, the god of metallurgy and creation and technology, and Hephaestus makes a shield for Achilles that has all of these scenes carved on it, incredibly intricate, and it's described at great length in an ekphrasis, which famously can't quite be real. At least it defies physical interpretation, and it uses the medium of language, of poetry, to describe something that we can picture but couldn't quite build, because the whole thing is playing out almost like a movie. Like there's moving action going on in it, and everything is happening, and there's all these intricately detailed scenes that are going on. And something kind of similar is happening here, in that on the walls of Juno's temple there are scenes from the Iliad that are kind of playing out. Like the movie of the Iliad is almost carved or projected or painted onto the walls of the temple. And this is a really striking moment that Virgil engineers, where the heroes of the new epic, Aeneas, Virgil's Aeneas, comes up face to face with the story of the old epic, the Iliad, and Homer's poetry. And they're basically looking at their predecessors. They're looking at their own personal history, because Aeneas has just escaped from the fall of Troy, but they're also, at a meta level, they're looking at their literary predecessors. And Virgil is coming face to face here with Homer, who has been in the background the whole time. And so it's a key moment artistically for Virgil and emotionally for Aeneas. And one of the most famous passages in the whole poem comes here, where Aeneas recognizes that he is being depicted. His history here is part of epic history. And so, as always, I'm writing my own translation here in Alexandrine, unrhymed English Alexandrines, translating the Latin of Virgil. And here's just a section of the passage where Aeneas recognizes the fall of Troy depicted on Juno's temple. He stopped short in tears. "What place on earth," he said, "Achates, where in all the regions of the world is there a land not yet brimful of all our toil? Look, Priam, reputation has its own rewards. Yes, even here, the grief of things will bring its tears, and everything that dies will touch the mind of man. Relax. Your fame will bring you a degree of safety." He's talking to Achates, saying, don't be afraid. It turns out we're famous. We're the heroes of this story. So everybody knows about us. No land on earth hasn't heard. And this, of course, is Virgil also winking at us to say these guys are already heroes in an epic before they even embark on their own journey. They're already known throughout the world in the same way that the Iliad in real life has made the story of Troy famous. Here, the story of Troy is famous throughout the world, and this is one of the most well-known and beautiful lines in the poem. Sunt lacrimae rare et mentem mortalia tangunt. And I've translated it into two lines because it's difficult to get all of that packed into one line, but there are tears of things is literally what it means. And res in Latin is a very potent word, packed, charged with all sorts of associations. The res publica is the republic, that is the affairs of the state, but res are like all of the great deeds and things that happen and matters that afflict the soul. So there are tears of things, tears for events, and mentem mortalia tangunt, and mortal things touch the mind. So I've said the grief of things will bring its tears, and everything that dies will touch the mind of man. Very, very famous line. And now he goes on to look at these scenes that are on the wall. So he says, and feeds his soul on empty paintings, drenching his face with rivulets of tears. He groaned. He saw the warriors around the citadel. The Greeks were pressing hard upon the youth of Troy, and here Achilles, bristling in his chariot, was driving hard upon the Phrygians. This is a very Iliadic scene taking place in a very Odyssean moment. So there's more kind of wheels within wheels going on here. And Aeneas starts crying what I think of as like anime tears. If you've watched a lot of anime, you know, there's a certain effect where, the emotions are very heightened in anime. And if an anime character is really just crying, but it's sort of funny a little bit, they have these like wavy rivers of tears that come pouring down their face. And that's what Virgil says happens to Aeneas. Umectat flumine voltum largoque. With a great river of tears, he drenches his face. And so that's obviously meant to draw us into the sorrow of the moment, the anguish and the pain of discovering his own story reflected back at him. But at this point, we should expect a bit of a record scratch. It's like that moment in Arrested Development, where the record scratches and Bluth says, "You're probably wondering how I got here." For us, it's like, wait a second, was the Iliad a tragedy? Because there's lots of sorrow for the dead in the Iliad. It's a big poem with a lot of emotions, including tragedy, including the sorrow of the death of the Trojans and also the loss of Achilles. But it's a Greek poem about Greeks, and the Greeks win the war. So you think, like, okay, wasn't this kind of like a good thing ultimately for Greece? And Virgil here is showing us the Iliad through Trojan eyes and saying, no, it was a tragedy. This was actually, and you can almost see the whole poem retold now. You can go back and reread that whole poem sort of without even actually rereading it, but you see it again now in this new light, through a new perspective, through the tears of Aeneas. And this is one of the classic effects that epics can have on other epics, is you sort of start out with one great poem like the Iliad, and then you have another poem that is consciously in relationship to that poem, and through the lens of that poem, the old poem also takes on new meaning. So it's kind of like Die Hard turns into a Christmas movie when you see it that way, right? The Iliad turns into a tragedy when you see it through Aeneas, through Trojan eyes. And it's not like that isn't there, present in Homer's poem. Of course, there is plenty of tragedy and plenty of attention paid to the Trojan perspective in Homer, but now the Trojans are our heroes, and so we kind of emphasize that dimension of Homeric poetry in a new way, and the poem almost takes on a whole new light. This happens all the time, kind of a retelling or a repurposing of old literature. The tragedians do it with the epic poets do it with one another, as is happening here, and it's kind of the same as what happens in a musical like Wicked, which we've been talking about a lot, but I actually think it's also kind of different. So in Wicked, or in a story like Wicked, what you have is a transformation of the events. You actually retell the story so that different things happen. And you've been told one thing by the original author, but now I'm going to tell you something different. That original author was lying. And that's not what happens here. None of the events from the Iliad get changed by this encounter. None of the underlying fact pattern, I should say, gets changed by this encounter, but the whole character of the poem, the whole mood of the poem shifts because the perspective shifts. So really, actually, what's going on here is something a little bit more like Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon. Rashomon is a movie by the great Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa. And in that movie, we do have differing versions of events, but we also have the same events told in a different perspective. And yes, people get different things right, different things wrong, but the idea is through different eyes, this whole thing looks different. And maybe even a better comparison would be The Last Duel, which is a more recent movie about the last duel fought in Europe, and it's told several times from several different perspectives, again, with differing underlying events, but with the assumption that there's something that went on that is now being told from a variety of different perspectives and seen through a bunch of different lenses. Of course, the other major comparison here would be the Gospel, which has a one underlying sequence of events that is then told from 4 different narrative perspectives. We're getting a little mini version of that here from Aeneas and from Virgil, saying, war is hell. War is tragedy. Even though there's glory in it, even though we've enjoyed the stories of the Iliad before, this is a veteran. Aeneas here is done with war. He's full of sorrow. He's full of lacrimae rerum, tears of things. And all he would love most of all is to settle down and to stop and to put his work away. And the awful thing is that we know as we read this opening book is he can't, because of course this is only the first book of the story of the founding of Rome, first of 12 books of this poem. And so of course there's a terrible melancholy to feeling that this story of love and war begins when its main character is already completely worn out by war. We start at the end of a war, and we start with misery, and we start with the lacrimae rerum, the sorrow of things that looks back on the past with great weariness and great pain. And that's why when finally Aeneas does meet Dido, he would be crazy not to want to stay, which is what she offers him. And there's one other passage I want to read to you actually from a little earlier when Aeneas is looking out on the building of Carthage, just to give you a sense of how tempting, how inviting this city looks to Aeneas and what kind of frame of mind he's in, because it's really important for everything that comes next. And this next passage that I'm going to read to you is, again, one of the marquee passages from the Aeneid. It's quoted again and again, and it gets picked up by all sorts of later authors, and that is the simile of the bees. So Virgil is looking out on the Carthaginians building their new city, their urbs. Importantly, this is not some little burg or town. This is a full-fledged city, and Aeneas is jealous that they're getting along so well, that they've really made it onto a pretty advanced stage of their development. And as they're working, we get this qualis, this Latin word qualis, which signals that we're about to go up on a simile, and Virgil does it big, man. This is one of those similes that has really struck home for generations and generations, and here's how it goes. He says, like bees beneath the summer sun in meadow groves, when hard at heavy work among the fresh new blooms, they usher out their offspring, now mature, or when they pack their cells to bursting with the nectared ooze of honey, or they take deliveries from those who come in laden with new goods, or else they herd the shambling drones out of their pens. The work is buzzing, and the honeyed air is thick with sense of time. Oh, fortunate are those whose walls already rise, Aeneas says, and peers along the city's skyline. They're busy bees. If you've ever used that phrase, you have made reference to an idea that goes back in a distant chain to Virgil. There were bees in literature before. He didn't invent the idea of talking about bees, but he really crafted this simile to such an iconic pitch that it became the image forever afterward of industry. I think this is why some biographers in the ancient world seem to have thought that Virgil was raised by a beekeeper, because they thought he knew this trade so well that this was really just close to hand for him as he looked for an image. I think that must be an apocryphal story just based on how indelible this image is. There's something about it that really sticks in the mind. I think it's the combination of the pastoral scene, which is another one of Virgil's famous themes, is this kind of idyllic meadow grove scene, and that's another genre of ancient literature that's got all kinds of traditions of its own. And Virgil himself in the Georgics wrote another scene of bees moving around, so he was well versed in this whole kind of poetry that tells these beautiful stories about shepherds sporting in the fields and these kind of luxury scenes, but he was always complicating them with these difficult or troubled images. And here, of course, he takes that image of the idyllic country scene and he fills it with bees that are hard at heavy work. There's a combination of beautiful new summer blooms with the hot summer sun beating down, and the bees don't stop for a moment. And there's something kind of adorable, there's something poignant about it, but it's also a scene of real industry that invites us to think about Roman virtues of industry that are here being kind of prefigured by the Carthaginians. This is a picture of what good hard work looks like. We're not just here to lie about and lounge in the summer sun. We're here to work, dang it, and to fill the cells with honey and pack away all this food. It's kind of a masterpiece of contradictions and the unexpected. And that's one of Virgil's great strengths, I think, and something he doesn't get enough credit for, because people are always comparing him with Homer and raising all these Homeric parallels. I've said before that there's a case to be made that he's just a derivative, second-rate poet. I don't think that's true at all. And the more I talk through this poem with you, the more I think it really is a masterwork. And one reason why is Virgil never goes quite where you expect him to go. He's always taking the picture that he gives you, the image that he's come up with, and the reference that you're having in your mind, and then he's just slipping in something else, a little bit different, kind of giving you an alternate picture or something that maybe a fly in the ointment or a little pang of nostalgia to come along with the joy. There's always something kind of playing against a counterpoint, playing against the imagery. And I gave you one core example last week from book one when I was talking about all of the love imagery, the Venus imagery. And of course, Venus herself shows up in book one. And there's this weird counterpoint going on between erotic fixation and desire and this sort of the poem being saturated with sex, but also the kind of cleanliness and order and industry of Diana, the virgin hunter goddess. And Virgil's always playing those elements, those different elements off against each other. And he does that here. It's an idyllic, beautiful scene, but it's also a scene of sweat and labor and hard work. And that is what he wants us to be thinking about here, about the contrast between luxury and work. It would be great for the bees to just lie back and enjoy themselves and live inside an idyllic poem. And that's a poem that maybe Virgil wants us to think Aeneas would be happy to live in, but he can't because he has a labor. He has work to do. And this is something that C.S. Lewis, in his work on the Aeneid, was always emphasizing, that the poem is obsessed with labor and moles, with work and burden and toil and things that have to be done. And this passage alone contains opus and labor and all these Latin words that mean effort, labor. And so Aeneas is going to travel in his journey throughout many different scenes of other poems that he would like to be in, other histories that he would like to live, and he can't because there's a work set out for him by fate. He's destined toward an end point and an end goal, and of course that's how the Romans are being invited to view themselves too. Yeah, sure, you could make a luxuriant alliance with the old world, with the kingdoms. You could be Antony and just kind of loose yourself with Cleopatra. You could travel these other roads, these other paths, but you aren't going to be able to do that because you are Rome. Something in you is driving you to be great, to be the lords of the world. And the pinnacle of this sentiment, this feeling of wistfulness, is going to come in book 6 down the line. When we get to the journey into the underworld, there's another famous speech in which Aeneas' father, Anchises, says to him, other cities are going to be great in other ways. Other civilizations will make great art. They will do great astronomy. You, Romans, your art is to subdue the world and bring peace to the world. And of course, he's thinking here of the contrast with Greece. Greece is known for its philosophy, for its arts, for its culture. Rome could be great in all those ways, but it has a job to do for all time and for history, and that is to bring peace to the world and to subdue the Mediterranean. Aeneas is the perfect figure for that, because he could stay with Dido. He longs to stay with Dido. Oh, fortunate are those whose walls already rise. Oh, these people who have made it, who are doing fine, and they have a city skyline, and wouldn't it be great to stay? And that's the first thing Dido offers. When they show up and finally meet up with Dido, they find some of their other companions who had gotten separated from them. It's this joyous reunion. Dido turns out to be a nice person and not an evil queen. She welcomes them. She says, we're fellow refugees. Come on along and live with us. And that invitation, which is very alluring now, to stay in the meadow and lounge in the summer sun and fall in love with the queen, is only going to get more inviting as this love story carries on. So we've now transitioned, we're within the war loop, but we're transitioning into the love loop, and we're going to get the story of Dido and Aeneas, but not before we get a little war loop within the love loop, which is going to be the story of Aeneas at Troy, escaping Troy. All of that is to come, but we're going to leave the story there and pick up next time, just to show you how generative, how fertile this image of the bees has been. I wanted to read you one other passage from a much later poem, Keats's To Autumn, his Ode to Autumn from the 1820s. And this is a very, very different poem with all sorts of other concerns. It's about the romantic view of the seasons, capital R romantic, and 19th century ideas about science and nature and the spirits of the earth and the field and whatever. But Keats pulls up here all of this idyllic kind of pastoral imagery, and the bees make an appearance. Here's the first stanza. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd, and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. It's a very, very beautiful opening, and if you didn't know about this whole history of Virgil and pastoral and the Aeneid and all of that, then it would just be a beautiful poem in and of its own right, But when we have read Virgil, we can see little echoes here, and some of them may not even be intentional, but I still think they're there to plump the fruit with ripeness and o'erbrimming the clammy cells. That brings us back to packing their cells to bursting with the nectared ooze, the way they took all that honey and they just stuffed it into their hives. And then the later flowers that show up here in summertime, we have the Noah flora, the new flowers that show up in Virgil. And so the resonance of this image with all its intricate complexities, the beautiful idyllic sunshine and the hard labor and the wistfulness of having to press on when you would like to stay, all of that is there as we embark upon this war and love story, the song of war and love of Aeneas and Dido. Okay, that's it for the Aeneid for now. We're going to put a pin in that, come back and continue the story down the road next week. Now, before I take a mailbag question, I wanted to let you know the results of my request last week. You may recall I asked people to tell me if they want to hear about figures of speech. That is, if they like it when I tell you about stuff like ekphrasis. We talked about hendiadys and zeugma and all these classical figures of speech that help to understand the use of language, which is I think, a great joy in and of itself. And the people have spoken. They want more figures of speech. Many, many people said, yes, love the figures of speech, want to know more. However, I am mindful of the people that just want to hear the story. And so today I figured I would start a new kind of pattern, a new habit, which is I'm going to tell you the story and I'm going to walk through the poem in the main section of the episode. And then at the very end, I'll have a little segment called It Figures. And there should be some sort of sound effect to go along with it. I don't know, like do, it figures. It's time for the part of the show where we talk about figures of speech. So I'm going to just bracket this at the end here and tell you about some of these other technical things so that if you only like the story, you'll get the story up front. And then now I will tell you a little bit about literary figures of speech. And today there's an obvious candidate for the figure of speech to talk about, and that is Chiasmus, another wonderful name. They all have great names. And the reason Chiasmus makes perfect sense to talk about now is because ring composition, that is the whole structure of storytelling that I've been talking about today, ring composition is also called chiastic structure. And it's called that because the figure of chiasmus is just any structure that begins with one thing and ends with the same thing, and inside you have two of a different thing. So the classic way of saying this is it goes A, B, B, A. And a ring structure is chiastic because it has A at the beginning and A at the end, and then inside you have B and B. So in this example of love and war that I'm talking about with the Aeneid, we have the war on the outside would be the A. So you have war on the outside, and then on the inside you have love. So it's war, love, war. And that's a chiastic structure. And that's at the giant big level of the narrative itself. The plot has its own chiastic structure, but you can also have chiasmus within a line at the level of the word, and this is a very common thing to do. It's again very satisfying to have A, B, B, A in some form or another within the rhyme scheme or the meter or the poem itself. So you can have chiastic rhyme schemes. If the poem rhymes A, B, B, A, then that's a chiastic rhyme scheme. Or you can have a chiastic line of verse itself, and there are plenty of examples of that throughout the Aeneid. There's also plenty of chiasmus elsewhere in other poetry. There's a famous line from Milton in which Milton says that when he was thinking about doing Paradise Lost, the story of the fall of Adam and Eve, it pleased me long choosing and beginning late. And if you think about it, long choosing and beginning late is a chiastic structure because you have long at the beginning and late at the end, and then on the inside you have choosing and beginning. So that's A-B-B-A. Long, choosing, and beginning late is chiasmus, and it has a fun kind of stutter step rhythm to it or something like that. And there is an example of that in the famous line that I talked about earlier on about the lacrimae rerum. Sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortalia tangunt. When I translated it, I said it's like there are tears of things and mortal things touch the mind. In the Latin, you have a verb, sunt, at the beginning of the line, and you have another verb, tangunt, at the end of the line, and then inside you have the subjects of those two verbs. There are tears of things, and the mortalia are doing the tangunt. So there's sunt lacrimae and mortalia tangunt, verb, noun, verb, chiasmus. That's how it works. And this is like, if you think about clap on, clap off, the clapper, that old advertisement where they had a little jingle and you could clap to turn the lights on and clap to turn the lights off. Clap on, clap off, the clapper. This is A-B-B-A, chiasmus. So anytime you hear that A-B-B-A structure, you'll start to notice that jingle pattern in your head. That's what chiasmus is, and the ring composition itself is chiastic in its structure. The name, by the way, kind of sounds like chasm, but that's not where it comes from. It comes from the Greek letter chi, which is an X, because if you put AB on one line and then BA on the next line, you can draw an X between the B's and an X between the A's, and that makes for chi or chiasmus. All right, this has been It Figures, the segment of the show where I talk about figures of speech so that nerds like me who love that kind of stuff can nerd out about it, but people that just want the story can listen to the opening part of the episode and come back for the mailbag question. So every week I like to take a question from a listener, and they come to me through Substack. That's rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Easiest way to get in touch with me is to subscribe there and to send me a DM. I love answering questions about all and sundry things. These days, I'm getting a lot of questions, obviously, about the Aeneid. So if you've got questions about the Aeneid, I would love to hear them. But I also happily answer questions about all sorts of other stuff. And it's the easiest way to do that, one more time, is to DM me on Substack. That's also how you can get my audiobook of Paradise Lost, how you can get my weekly essays and movie reviews and all sorts of fun other stuff that I put up there at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. So today I have a mailbag question from Lillian, which I really enjoyed. And Lillian says that she's embarking on the Aeneid with me for the first time, which, first of all, is awesome. That's very fun. And I know I have a lot of listeners who are doing that, who have never read the poem but are following along. I do recommend the Alan Mandelbaum translation, which I think is still the best one kind of on the market for English speakers. And if you're just following along for the first time, then hopefully this is a helpful way to kind of get your bearings. But Lillian says one of the reasons that she was hesitant, maybe in the past, to crack the poem is because she had an idea that it was really just propaganda for Augustus. She says, wasn't this written under the Empire? And didn't this kind of end up being Augustus propaganda? But did it accidentally also become good art, or can propaganda be good art, or what's going on here? And I love this question because it kind of highlights a way of thinking that we have in the modern world that might not be quite right. We have this sort of simple idea, propaganda is bad, and it's not real art, and it's clunky, and it's ham-fisted, and it doesn't work. And then there's true art, which is totally divorced from politics and separate from politics, and doesn't get co-opted in this kind of political vein. And I think a lot of this comes from anti-war sentiment. So we look at war posters and we think, that's propaganda, and that's just there to sell you on something. It's not there to do art. It's there to sell you on something. And unfortunately, the world is not quite so simple. Art does have a power all its own to show you truths, to reveal beauty. All of those things are real. Goodness, truth, and beauty, that old trifecta, go into art. But it is also possible to use that power in service of various ends. And I would submit that there are good and bad ways to do that. So there are propaganda posters. I mean, I'm thinking of like COVID-19 posters that I just found incredibly ugly and bad. But then there are some very skilled war propaganda posters from all sorts of wars throughout the 20th century. The wars themselves were terrible, but sometimes the art is actually quite skillful and good. So one thing to think about is that the use of art in service of politics can be bad, it can be amazing, and it can be everything in between. Now, that doesn't mean that politics doesn't sometimes corrupt art. If you are telling a lie or you're making a lie look pretty in the service of politics, then you are doing something bad in your art, and ultimately I think your art will suffer for it. But there are also works of art that are nationalist or in favor of certain national ideas, certain political ideas, that are also very beautiful because they use certain realities that only art can convey to make a case for some political point of view. So this relationship is much more complicated, perhaps, than we've been led to believe. And in the case of the Aeneid, it's insanely complicated because actually it's not 100% clear that the Aeneid really is in favor of Augustus. This is one of the big questions in scholarship. Did Virgil mean to praise Augustus, or did he mean subtly to undermine Augustus? And of course, there's been a long-standing belief in the ancient world that this was a pro-Augustus poem. This was a celebration of the glory of Rome in the new age of empire. And when ancient critics look on it, that's what they understand it to be. So far as we know, it's only in the modern day that we start questioning this. But in the modern day, we do get kind of disillusioned with propaganda, with war itself, with the dangers of totalitarianism. And we start to wonder whether Virgil, who was a great artist, also sensed those dangers, the dangers of war and the dangers of totalitarianism. And people start to read into the poem these anxieties or even condemnations of Augustus. And we're going to get to a lot of them down the line. Some of the most famous ones come in Book 6. I also mentioned the ambiguous ending, which ends with an act of violence. And so there's a question whether this glorious founding is actually tainted by evil and violence. And it's not unlike the modern problems that we are having with the American founding, when people say, yes, this glorious story that we like to tell actually has all these nasty, ugly things like slavery in it, right? And people in the modern day start to wonder whether Virgil is doing something similar. Now, Virgil would be hugely capable of that, of course, because we've just seen that he's able to take a scene that looks like one thing and then kind of splash in the opposite thing. So you take a scene that looks like an idyllic scene and then you fill it with industrious bees that are working. You take a scene that looks like a beautiful woman and you fill it with danger. And you take a scene that looks like a love scene and you fill it with war, right? He's able to do that and to balance those elements against each other and to send little hidden messages and Easter eggs, and he's a master at all that stuff. His poetry is really dense that way. And so it would be possible that he wrote this whole poem to criticize Augustus under his own nose. But I actually don't think that's the most likely story, because there's plenty in the poem to suggest that this is destined, this is fated, that Rome is glorious and Rome needs to come into being, and Aeneas has to give up all this stuff for it. And so I think, Lillian, that the reason the poem isn't propaganda in our sense, that it is just a kind of thudding, nationalist, kind of dull, ham-fisted work of propaganda, is that Virgil does actually mean to praise Augustus, but he means to do it in a realistic and honest way that acknowledges all of the trade-offs that come with war, all of the suffering, everything Aeneas has to give up, all that he would have loved to do to stay in Carthage, all of the longing and beauty and everything that had to die, Carthage included, everything that had to die in order for Rome to be born, and everything that had to be lost in order for the empire to come into being. The bloody civil wars, the end of the Republic. It's a poem of intense sadness and wistfulness, even though it is also a poem of celebration. And that's what makes Virgil a great artist. It's not that he doesn't praise Augustus, I think. It's not that he's not political and involved in politics. It's that he's involved in politics in service of the truth, and he's always first and foremost devoted to telling the fullest possible story in the fullest way that he can, as only an artist can, and in doing so, he actually ends up making a better case for Rome, for posterity, than if he had just insisted on everything was always great all the time and Augustus is perfect. Instead, he gave you Rome, warts and all, and said, even despite the suffering, it was worth it. That's what makes it a great work of art. That's why I'm excited to be reading it with you, and I will continue doing that week by week. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes as we continue on with this story, and I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.